Exercise 3-6.
Where will you live when you go back to Hong Kong, Steve?
Well, there's no problem there, because I live with my parents.
How do you like your accommodations in Tokyo?
It's a nice apartment, but it's rather expensive. Every month we have to pay a lot of money, especially for the heater.
It seems everyone agrees about that heater.
時たま僕ら日本人ですと、外国で豪華な宿泊施設を使わせてもらって、ぐっと感激しちゃったりして、急に偉くなったような気になります。
You mean when you're living overseas in an enormous flat, you think you're going to be elected chairman of the board next year or something? Now, let's talk about the language problems. Momoko-san, you speak very good English now. Did you speak English so well before you went to London?
あまりよくは話せなかったような感じですね。
I think she's being modest, don't you?
Her English is marvelous.
Did you have any language problems?
英語ですか？ありませんでした。一般的に言ってみて、日本の若い世代の人たちは今日では海外での問題なんかありませんよ。年配者に尋ねてみた方がましだと思うけどな。
Bando-san speaks absolutely excellent French, but he's an exception. I think you told me before that you just picked it up quite naturally and didn't make any particular effort to study.
フランス語を覚えるって、職場で働きながら同僚のフランス人を相手に覚えたんですよ。飛行機のそばで業者からの電話を受けなければならなかったり、トランシーバーを使ってフランス語で話さなければならなかったりでした。
パリではフランス人の友達ができたでしょ。
できましたよ。大勢いました。
外国でその国の友人を持つことはすごく便利だと思うんです。
Henry, I think you understood some Japanese before coming to Japan, didn't you?
Well, being third-generation Japanese American, born and raised in Hawaii, and hearing Japanese from my parents, but not really speaking to them in Japanese, I suppose I do understand a little. Prior to coming here, the extent of my Japanese was just asking a passenger for his ticket, not even being able to give good directions to the gate. It was like, as Bando-san said, a sort of life and death situation. You just had to do it. And being on the talkative side helps.
Exercise 3-7.
Did you ever get lost in Tokyo?
I certainly did, not being able to read any kanji or hiragana. I ended up in Ueno Station.
One of our Japanese staff in London only knew the way to his home if he started at the office. If he was somewhere away from the office, he would drive back to the location of the office and then drive home from there.
I have been here for about half a year, but I still have a language problem. I attended language classes for only 2 weeks, and after that we didn't have any more classes. Someone told me I really look like a Japanese, and everybody speaks to me in Japanese. At the moment my Japanese is very poor, just skoshi. I can read the kanji, but I don't know how to pronounce the words.
Shingeo, did you have any language difficulties in Los Angeles?
前にも言いましたように、多数の日本人職員がロスにいますから、何の問題も取り立ててはありませんでした。
But didn't you have to communicate with the Americans too?
上役は白人で、話す必要があれば、何としても理解するよう努めましたし、彼も僕を分かろうとしたので、意思疎通での問題は起きませんでした。
Betty, have you found that language is a barrier in any way?
Yes, indeed. I don't have any problem in the office because almost everybody I have to deal with speaks good English. But living, yes. There is a big problem in my daily communication with shopkeepers and taxi drivers. The second day after I arrived, I ran into such problems that I wanted to go home. I got into a taxi outside my flat. I wanted to go to the Imperial Hotel. So I said, Imperial Hotel, お願いします. I remembered the お願いします. And I got a, huh? So I thought my pronunciation of Imperial was too British. So I tried Imperial Hoteru and other variations on that pronunciation. Finally, I tried to write it down and thought maybe he could read Romanized Japanese, even if he couldn't understand. I was getting desperate. I didn't know where we were heading. So finally I thought, if I can get to some other place nearby, I can then take another taxi to the Imperial. The only place I could think of was Ginza. So he took me to Ginza and I spotted the Ginza Daiichi Hotel. So I pointed to the Ginza Daiichi.
でもまさかナンバーワンホテルとは言わなかったんでしょ?
I said Ginza Daiichi Hotel. Anyway, we got there and I asked the doorman to direct me to the Imperial Hotel and, of course, he then told the driver to go to the Teikoku Hotel. I didn't know that that was the one hotel which had two names. I was just desperate, you know. I was upset and didn't know what to do. It was my second day here.
Exercise 3, 8.
Well, it seems that for people being transferred to Tokyo, it is more difficult than for Japanese going overseas.
特にタクシーを利用するときはね。
Yes, because in London, taxi drivers know all the streets. If you don't know the way, you take a taxi, knowing they'll find the way for you.
東京では街路に名前がついていません。
It amazes me that if I'm traveling with Japanese friends, they will tell the taxi driver exactly which route to take and where to turn, and so on. The taxi driver usually doesn't know.
ところで、何か外国人のための特別の社交クラブのようなものが日本にありますか?
I think there are several.
我々日本人は外国ではいつも寄り合っているんですがね。
We don't do that so much.
日本航空の中でもですか?
I must say that the idea occurred to me to start a JAL Japan Gaijin Club, but there are very few of us here. If you rule out the IASCO pilots, who are here with their families mostly, there are very, very few. Last year, on the occasion of English Ozora's first birthday, we invited all the readers in Japan to a birthday party in this room, and really very few actually came. People were on shift work and couldn't get here, or their invitation reached them too late. Up in Sendai, there are some English instructors, but they obviously couldn't travel all that way. I don't think the numbers in JAL are big enough yet. But there is a Japan-British Society here, and also, well, this is rather interesting, there is a Foreign Wives of Japanese Association. There is an American girl working for JAL, Marcy Watanabe, who is a member.
But I do think that Japanese working abroad tend to stick together much more than we do. I don't particularly want to be with a bunch of English people all the time, especially as they always talk about life in Japan and how expensive it is. You know, it gets boring.
Try to imagine that a young future trainee comes to you and says, I understand that you were a trainee in... Can you give me some advice? I'm leaving for next month.
Well, being Hawaiian, I'd say, bring a lot of warm clothes. Be well prepared for a cultural shock, which you cannot really imagine. You can read all about Japan and all the books that have been published. But until you really live here and experience the very, very homogeneous society, it is unimaginable. That is basically, I think, what I would prepare the person for.
ヒースロー KI へ行くんだったら言えることは、こことあそこでは本当に大した違いはなく、勤務に関して言えば日本航空のことだし、標準的な手続きがあることだし、チェックインの仕方とか旅客扱いとかなのですから。
Exercise 3, 9.
What would you say to somebody from Hong Kong coming over here, Steve?
I think I would advise them to learn cooking before they come over here, as well as general housewifery.
Are you finding it hard?
Well, I can cook a little bit. If I go out to eat every day, it is too boring. There is a limited number of cheap places. Did you cook for yourself in Los Angeles, Shigeo?
もちろんそうでした。自炊は週に3、4日でした。
What advice would you give a young Japanese going to LA?
ビクビクしないこと、心配無用なのは言葉の問題と言ってもいいでしょう。日本語で通じるんですから。でも、英語で話したかったら。
That's not the point, though. Surely the whole point of being transferred overseas is to try. I am very guilty of being lazy and not speaking Japanese.
But I think, in the case of trainees, that is one of the big reasons for going overseas, to learn the language and customs of the country. Because as an international airline, the more international we are, the better, I think.
個人的に言ってみてですけど、新規にロスへ行く人に対してだったら、私は本当にかなり力になってあげられますね。アドバイスしてあげたいこととなりますと、毎日の生活管理法とか、買い物とか、それからどうやって目的の場所へ行ったらいいかなどといったところでしょうね。率直に言って、私にはロサンゼルスの生活というものは、実に楽しいものでしてね。ロスでは嫌な経験とか悪い印象なんか、まるっきりありませんでしたね。ですから誰に対しても、どうやったらロスで楽しく生活していけるか、教えてあげられるんですよ。
Bando-san, what would you tell a young Japonais off to Paris?
進めたいこととしては、日本人の社会から遠ざかるようにしてほしいということですね。長い目で見れば、そうした方が我々にとっても、またそれだけでなくって、日本航空にとっても良いことになるでしょうね。
That is a very nice cue to go on to the next question, which concerns getting away from JAL, getting away from the office. When a married man is transferred overseas with his family life continues in very much the same way as before, I imagine. But when single people go overseas, they leave their social life behind them and they have to replace it with something. How did you spend your spare time in Los Angeles, Shigeo? Yours is a particular case, of course, because you left your wife behind in Tokyo.
坂東さんは賛成しないでしょうけど、大抵夕方は自炊したり、招かれて日本人の上役のところへ行ったりして、そんなわけで日本の社会にくっつきっぱなしってところでしたね。
Exercise 3, 10.
I think on the west coast of the USA, it is a little different from Paris, isn't it? There are so many Niseis and Sanseis who speak Japanese.
まるっきり違います。
UCLA のキャンパスによく行ったものでしたけど、UCLA のあたりで買い物をするのは楽しかったですよ。UCLA の学生みたいなふりをしたりしてね。実際は既婚者だったんですけど、でもロスでは気分的には独身だったんですよ。
単なる妄想といったとこですよ。
What did you do in your spare time in London, Momoko?
あちらはいろいろあれこれと娯楽がありますし、それで劇場へ行ったり映画へ行ったりしました。
英国人の友達ができましたか？
はい、できました。暇な時間に一人で家に引きこもったりして、何をしようかなって迷ったりすることなんかありませんでした。
Shingio, when you're not cooking, what are you doing?
食べてますよ。
Washing up.
Drinking sake.
I have 2 days off each week, and I spend 1 day shopping. I go to the supermarket, clean my rooms, send my clothes to the sentakuya. That's why I advise people, before they come, to learn about a housewife's work. Sometimes I hold a party in my room for drinking and chatting. If I have enough money, I go out for drinking and dancing or something like that.
When I arrived, I already knew so many people because I had been with Japan Airlines for such a long time. So I was very lucky in that many people offered to take care of me when I first arrived. It is interesting to see that the numbers have dwindled recently. I think they realize that I am now very well settled and perhaps don't need so much assistance as I did when I first came. I tend to socialize as much as I can, and I'm the sort of person that does not like being at home on my own. Even if I don't go out, I'll telephone someone and say, "Come and have a drink." But it is difficult, I must admit, to meet new people. When I meet somebody new, then I try to keep in touch. I think we tend to move very much in the same small, limited circle. Maybe half Japanese, half English.
Bando-san, you mentioned vaguely that you used to escape from the Japanese community in Paris, but you didn't tell us where you escaped to. How did you spend your time?
レストランへは勤めてフランス人の職員と行くようにしましてね。なぜかっていうと、我々日本人はパリだけではなく、海外ではどこでもいつも行くところっていうと日本料理店とか特別高いレストランなんですからね。でも僕は勤めて生活は並のフランス人職員に合わせようってわけでしてね。つまりフランス人職員ということは日本のサラリーマンに相当するわけです。そんなわけで上等なレストランはパリじゃそれほど知りませんけど、たくさん小さいのなら知っています。みんなとっても安くってね。フランス人には親しまれているような類です。
That's good.
ルーブル博物館には行ったことがないし、エッフェル塔のてっぺんまで行ったこともありません。
Well, I'm afraid time is catching up with us, and some of you have to get back to work at Hanada. So thank you all very much for sharing your experiences with us, and with English Ozora readers too.
Exercises for Chapter 4. On-the-Job Interpretation. Exercise 4.1. Interview Interpretation. In the following exercise, we will practice interview interpretation. The interviewer is asking questions in Japanese, and Mr. Lee is answering in English. You, as an interpreter, will change Japanese into English and English into Japanese, and help the participants communicate with each other. The tape has pauses with signals. When you hear a signal, please stop the tape immediately and interpret what has been said. Now, let's begin.
これは日本古来からの忘れられない音色を出す竹製の笛、すなわち尺八と呼ばれるものの音色なんです。でもこの音色を出しているのは年寄りとは全く無関係で、日本人とも縁もゆかりもない若者で、彼の名前はラリー・リー。23歳のアメリカ人で、尺八の音色にかけては得意中の得意。免許皆伝の腕前を持っておられます。ラリーさん、 尺八の忘れられない音色と言いましたが、これはどの程度等を得た表現だと思いですか？
It sounds clear, good to me. In fact, one of the main reasons I like the shakuhachi is this mysterious, almost religious aspect of the sound, and the whole history of the instrument.
どんなふうに尺八に興味を持つようになったんですか？
My first meeting with the shakuhachi was when I was still in the United States, and I had heard a recording of it. And I had no idea to study it then, but I happened to be in Japan later on, and then I just remembered having listened to that Japanese instrument, and I decided, since I'm here in Japan, maybe I should start studying it.
以前に他の楽器のご経験はおありだったんですか？
Yes, when I was maybe 8 years old, I played the piano for 2 years, and then in school I was in the brass band. I played the French horn for about 5 years.
お尋ねしますが、尺八は演奏が難しいものでしょうか？
Not any more difficult than any other instrument. I think any instrument, if you really get to know the instrument, and really get into the instrument, is difficult. But then, if you play the instrument that well, that much, if you like the instrument that much, it doesn't become work, it becomes enjoyment. So it's difficult, but it's not difficult.
一日の練習量はどのくらいですか？例えば、今回続けておられる東京での演奏会に備えてなどの場合は。
Not enough right now. Ideally, I would like to practice maybe 4 or 5 hours a day, but I can't right now.
楽器に打ち込む努力は大変なものと思われます。しかし、私の聞く限りでは、楽器自体に限界があるようにも思えます。この点をお断りしておきますが、多分、私自身にある文化的ズレ、つまり西洋と日本の一種の文化的ギャップのためなんでしょうかね。
No, I don't think you could say. Maybe it's a manifestation of my own poor playing, of my lack of control of the instrument yet.
いや、そうは思いません。私自身に多分いくらかショービニズム的なところがあって、多分より以上に自己批判したんです。
No, actually, ideally, I shouldn't show much of an effort while I'm playing the shakuhachi. It should seem effortless to me, and the sound should just come out effortlessly, in a sense that I would not be playing the shakuhachi, but the shakuhachi would be using me to produce a sound type of thing.
あなたと仲間の方は岩だらけの佐渡島の以前小学校だった建物に住んでらっしゃるんですか？
Yes, that is correct.
そこでの生活はいかがですか？
It's wonderful. I can't wait to get back.
そこでの生活は非常にスパルタ式であるように思いますが、仲間の方との一日の生活ぶりの詳しいことをお聞かせください。
Well, briefly we get up. For example, in the summertime, we will get up at 4 o'clock in the morning. In the winter, this becomes 5. Other than that, the schedule is about the same all year round, every day, no holidays, no Sundays. We get up at 4 o'clock, and we do perhaps a brief warm-up of our instruments, and then calisthenics, and then maybe run 10 kilometers in the morning, return and clean the house and do the washing and things like that. And then eat breakfast, which is at about maybe 6:15 or so, 6 o'clock. and after breakfast we will begin our practicing. In the morning, usually the drums and maybe chorus, the singing and dancing and our own individual instrument, for example, for me, the shakuhachi, other people the shamisen, and this goes on all morning. We have lunch at 11:30 or 12 or so, and in the summer we have a very brief afternoon nap. This luxury we aren't afforded in the winter, and then maybe from about 1 o'clock or so the afternoons are spent either practicing Japanese writing or practicing English, for which I will be their teacher. Reading a book, group reading, and perhaps listening to a record together and criticizing or discussing the record, and then around 3 o'clock, 2:30 or 3, begins our training, the marathon running, which we will practice for maybe 2 or 3 hours, running in the mountains or at the beach, or going to a nearby track, and this is maybe on average about 10 to 20 kilometers. Then we return, and it's time to eat supper. Maybe about 6 o'clock we have supper. And after supper, we have our free time, which is spent maybe again practicing our own individual instruments, or writing letters, or reading, or doing odds and ends. And then we go to bed. It depends on the individual. I'm a rather early sleeper. I will go to bed maybe about 9 or 10 o'clock. Some people go to bed later.
聞くところによりますと、酒もタバコも禁じられてるそうですね。それにテレビも新聞さえもないと承っております。ところで、このような厳しい軍隊方式のような生活は、民族音楽を深く掘り下げるのに必要なんでしょうか？
No, it's not necessary. Nothing's necessary, perhaps. If you do it this way, maybe, the result becomes better. It's an experiment. Who knows?
早朝の宿舎の掃除のことを話しておられましたけど、あなた方の仲間の佐渡島での生活を描いたフィルムでは、皆さんが鬼の面をつけていましたね。
Yes.
朝ですよ。
Yes.
あの面では視界が狭くなると思いますが、あの鬼の面についてまた仕事をするのにどうして面をつけて行うのか、その意味を説明してくださいませんか？
The demon masks or the oni masks are used in dancing, and some of the dancers use swords and very, how would you say, very fast dances, very strenuous dances, and they must be performed on a very narrow stage, is a very small area, and the field of vision, as you say, is very small wearing these masks, which all combined presents a very dangerous situation. So in order to get used to using the masks, to wearing the masks, in order to perform the dances well and safely, we have a policy of, in the morning, of doing this cleaning, house cleaning, and other times of wearing these masks just for regular day-to-day things. And this would perhaps help us to get used to this small area of vision so that we can perform the dances more safely, or...
あなた自身として何か長期的な野心といったものがおありですか？
Well, if you say long-range ambitions, maybe the only long-range ambition I have is just to become a better person.
それでは短期的なものでしたらどうでしょう？
To become a better shakuhachi player.
さて、ラリーさん、今後のご多幸とご成功を祈ります。良い演奏をされることを期待していますよ。過去4年間、佐渡島の人たちにとっては、風や雪や波の砕ける音と同じように、ほとんど生活の一部であった太鼓、尺八、 三味線の音色がここまで聞こえてまいります。島の人たちが夢でしか見ることのできなかったいろいろなところで、これらは素晴らしい音色となっているのです。
Exercise 4-2. Business Talk Interpretation. In the following exercise, we will practice interpretation through a business talk. Mr. Downing is speaking in English, and Mr. Nishimura in Japanese. Please change English into Japanese and Japanese into English. The tape has pauses with signals. When you hear a signal, please stop the tape immediately and interpret what has been said. Now let's begin.
Mr. Nishimura, I'm Peter Downing. How do you do? I'm glad to meet you in person, even though I feel I know you already through our letters.
どうぞよろしく。よくいらっしゃいました。東京までわざわざ恐縮です。きっと実り良いお話し合いができると思います。双方にとって有益な申し合わせができれば良いと考えております。ところで、商売の話に絞って進めてまいりましょうか。
First of all, I would like to review what we have discussed so far in our correspondence. I have copies of our letters here. In your letter of June 25th, you asked that we make an evaluation and provide you with an estimate of the annual sales potential for your products, subsequent to which we began a market survey. We then received your letter of July 18th, asking if we were interested in handling your products on an exclusive basis in the States and Canada. I'd like to base our discussion today on our answering letter of August 6th. Our general conditions for an exclusive agency would be these. 1. That all sales in the United States and Canada of goods in other than the user's brand be labeled with our EPI brand name. Second, that all previous customers' names and addresses be referred to us for contact. Third, that EPI be given the right to set prices for your products in our sales territory. Fourth, that we participate in research on and development of new parts. And finally, that Azuma investigates the possibility of marketing EPI products in Japan. I imagine that you have discussed these points, and if I could have your frank comments on these conditions, we can get this discussion going.
8月12日付の私どもの手紙で申し上げましたように、そちらで示されたポイントの3と4と5は受け入れることができます。すなわち、記者が販売する品目の価格設定の権限はもちろんそちらに終わりのはずです。それは議論には及びません。私どもの研究と開発についての記者の参加と協力は喜んで受け入れたいと存じます。また、合わせて海外の市場調査についてのご援助もお願いしたいところです。記者製品の日本での販売の可能性についても検討・調査いたしましょう。そのためには記者がこちらで販売することに関心を持っておられるこれらの製品の見積もり額と見本をいただけたらと思います。ただし、我が社のすべての製品をそちらの販売領域ではユーザーズブランドでなく記者のブランドで販売したいという点についてはその理由をはっきりお聞かせ願いたいのです。
Well, in order to explain our intention, I would first like to compare the setup we have in mind to the arrangement between Pentax and Honeywell, or Canon and Bell and Howell. After all, if we are going to set up an exclusive agency, all goods will pass through us, at least on paper, and it will give us wider exposure. Also, for advertising purposes, we can cover all the products we sell, both those we produce ourselves and those purchased from overseas manufacturers. We are also selling our name.
ご意向はわかるような気もしますが、一応その点はもう一度私どもの会社の同僚と話し合ってみたいと思います。記者の販売領域における現在及び以前に取引のあった私どもの顧客については、コンスタントにご購入いただいているお客様には ぜひとも従来通りの取引を継続し、今後も直接販売していきたいと思います。その際は、記者には販売活動抜きでも 5% のコミッションを差し上げたいと存じます。またこの場合は、これらの顧客には、私どものブランドで商品販売を続けていきたいと考えています。
In a case in which the customer is a user, I can accept your proposal. But a firm reselling your products cannot, or rather should not be placed in a position to compete with us. I mean, I do not want to have EPI brand meters competing with Azuma meters in our sales territory.
そちらの立場もわかりますし、記者の対案を受け入れても何らトラブルが起きるとは思いません。とにかくそういった顧客はこちらでケースバイケースで検討してみましょう。ご承知のように、私どもでは海外での我が社の製品の売り上げが増大することを切に願っているわけでして、その目的に向かっての宣伝及び販売方策における記者のお力添えを得たいのです。このタイプの販売促進活動の可能性についてどのようにお感じになっていらっしゃいますか？
We have great confidence that high-quality, low-priced meters in the made-to-order field and meters designed for highly specialized purposes and incorporated into our testing and monitoring devices have real sales growth potential. Advertising certainly couldn't hurt.
半額ずつ負担して大規模な宣伝活動に積極的に入っていきたいと思っていますが、その場合ご理解いただけると思いますが、ご提案の宣伝活動に対してはその是非の決定は当方にお任せ願いたいのですが。
That is fine with us. I think it would be advisable to discuss a budget prior to embarking on a project of this nature, but that kind of detail can be worked out any time.
代理店契約の詳細について最後に2、3話し合っておきたいことがあります。まず販売に関してですが、見本を差し上げ見積もり額の分も含めて 10% のコミッションを用意いたしましょう。また記者の販売領域から受けた問い合わせに関してはそちら宛てに戻すようにいたしましょう。ただし記者が仕入れるメーター及びインディケーター類は当社のものに限っていただきたいと思います。さらに合衆国での私どもの分野に関連する市場の動向なり新しい動きについて常に情報をいただきたいのですが、この点も同意を得たいと思います。また激烈な競争やその時々の経済状態によって場合によってはやむを得ずコミッションが 5% あるいはそれ以下になることがあるかもしれませんので、その点もご承知おき願いたいと思います。
I can understand and agree with these points, and I would like you to draft a contract based on our discussion for further detailed talks. I'm quite confident that we can establish a smooth working relationship. Thank you for your time and attention. I'll contact my associates in the States, and if you don't mind, I'd like us to meet again tomorrow.
はい、どうも。今までのところ順調で何よりです。明日でうまくまとまりがつきそうです。
See you again tomorrow.
Exercise 4-3. Speech interpretation. In the following exercise, we will practice interpretation through a speech given in English. The speech is an exercise for both consecutive and simultaneous interpretation. At first, please interpret it consecutively, and then do it simultaneously. Please stop the tape at the signals for the consecutive interpretation, but ignore the signals for the simultaneous interpretation. Now let's begin.
100 years ago, my country, the United States, was not one economy and culture, but two of them, so opposed to each other that 95 years ago they went to war against each other to test which one should prevail. My side, the South, lost that war, the battles of which were fought not on neutral ground in the waste of the ocean, but in our own homes, our gardens, our farms, as if Okinawa and Guadalcanal had been not islands in the distant Pacific, but the precincts of Honshu and Hokkaido. Our land, our homes were invaded by a conqueror who remained after we were defeated. We were not only devastated by the battles which we lost, the conqueror spent the next 10 years after our defeat and surrender despoiling us of what little war had left. The victors in our war made no effort to rehabilitate and reestablish us in any community of men or of nations. But all this is past. Our country is one now. I believe our country is even stronger because of that old anguish, since that very anguish taught us compassion for other peoples whom war has injured. I mention it only to explain and show that Americans from my part of America at least can understand the feeling of the Japanese young people of today, that the future offers them nothing but hopelessness, with nothing any more to hold to or believe in. Because the young people of my country during those 10 years must have said in their turn, "What shall we do now? Where shall we look for the future? Who can tell us what to do, how to hope and believe?" I would like to think that there was someone there at that time, too, to speak to them out of what little experience and knowledge a few more years might have added to what he had, to reassure them that man is tough, that nothing, war, grief, hopelessness, despair, can last as long as man himself can last, that man himself will prevail over all his anguish, provided he will make the effort to believe in man and in hope, to seek not for a mere crutch to lean on, but to stand erect on his own feet by believing in hope and in his own toughness and endurance. I believe that is the only reason for art, for the music, the poetry, the painting, which man has produced and is still ready to dedicate himself to. That art is the strongest and most durable force man has invented or discovered with which to record the history of his invincible durability and courage beneath disaster, and to postulate the validity of his hope. I believe it is war and disaster which remind man most that he needs a record of his endurance and toughness. I think that is why, after our own disaster, there rose in my country, the South, a resurgence of good writing, writing of a good enough quality that people in other lands began to talk of a regional, Southern literature, even until I, a countryman, have become one of the first names in our literature which the Japanese people want to talk to and listen to. I believe that something very like that will happen here in Japan within the next few years. That out of your disaster and despair will come a group of Japanese writers whom all the world will want to listen to, who will speak not a Japanese truth, but a universal truth. Because man's hope is in man's freedom. The basis of the universal truth which the writer speaks is freedom in which to hope and believe, since only in liberty can hope exist. Liberty and freedom not given man as a free gift, but as a right and a responsibility to be earned if he deserves it, is worthy of it, is willing to work for it by means of courage and sacrifice, and then to defend it always. And that freedom must be complete freedom for all men. We must choose now, not between color and color, nor between kind and kind, nor between ideology and ideology. We must choose simply between being slave and being free. Because the day is past now when we can choose a freedom established on a hierarchy of freedom, on a caste system of degrees of equality like military rank. We think of the world today as being a helpless battleground on which two mighty forces face each other in the form of two irreconcilable ideologies. I do not believe they are two ideologies. I believe that only one of them is an ideology, because the other is simply a human belief that no government shall exist immune to the check of the consent of the governed, that only one of them is a political state or ideology, because the other one is simply a mutual state of man, mutually believing in mutual liberty, in which politics is merely one more of the clumsy methods to make and hold good that condition in which all man shall be free. A clumsy method, until we have found something better, as most of the mechanics of social democracy creak and rattle. But until we do find a better, democracy will do, since man is stronger and tougher and more enduring than even his mistakes and blundering.
Exercise 4. Conference interpreting. In the following exercise, we will practice conference interpreting. Listen to the following mixed panel discussion in English and Japanese. Please interpret English into Japanese and Japanese into English simultaneously. Now, let's begin.
来賓各位並びに各国代表の皆様、ここにご来席をいただきましたことに心から感謝を申し上げます。私、宮村健六と申しますが、皆様のご協力を得て司会をさせていただきます。早速、パネリストのご紹介をさせていただきます。こちらの左側から、ロンドン大学のジョセフ・アルバートソン教授。次に、ソルボンヌ大学のシャルル・プリオ教授。次が、ボン大学世界経済研究所のボルフガン・エステルマン博士。そして、こちらが東西大学の中塚一郎教授。次はローレンス・ブレイナード教授。ニューヨーク大学経済学部主任教授でいらっしゃいます。その次に行きまして、一番手前は、モスクワ大学経済研究センターのイワン・ストラビンスキー博士。以上の方々であります。そこで、ただいまご紹介いたしました順序で、パネリストにお話ししていただきたいと思います。なお、お一人の話は3分間に制限させていただき、続いて1時間程度の公開討論をパネリストの皆様にお願いし、その後30分ほど休会いたします。ご出席の皆様で質問がございましたら、休会の間に用紙にご記入の上、ご提出願います。そこで、まず最初のお話をアルバートソン教授にお願いしたいと思います。
The theme of today's panel discussion is how to overcome the current worldwide economic crisis. It is indeed true that the nations of the world have been closely cooperating in adopting a demand control policy as an anti-inflation measure. Consequently, the world economy today is experiencing a recession accompanied by rising commodity prices, which are not likely to decline. That is to say, a stagflation. In order to break the recession, the demand control policy ought to be relaxed, but that will not be enough to lead the problem to its final solution. Now, I'd like to state my conclusion first, as my speech time is limited to only 3 minutes. In my wishful opinion, I feel we shall be able to overcome the worldwide economic crisis confronting us today. In order to succeed, I believe the major precondition should be solidarity between labor and capital regarding the current difficult economic situation. In this sense, I think the resolution for curbing wage increases of the recent Trade Union Congress should be highly appreciated as a fair and sound judgment given by English people, aiming at breaking the vicious cycle of price and wage hikes.
ありがとうございました。アルバートソン教授の物価及び賃金に関する貴重なご意見でした。これは大変難しい問題と思われますが、日本でも財界、産業界は来年の春闘における大幅賃上げの要求は一段とインフレに拍車をかけるものとして警告を発しております。詳細については後ほどさらに討論の中で説明していただくことになりましょうが、では次の発言者プリオ教授にお願いすることにいたしましょう。先生、どうぞ。
In the midst of increased fear of a worldwide recession, the French economy has, since the inauguration of President Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, been in a rather unfavorable position, with increased unemployment and other problems, resulting in a necessity for its boom policy build-up. At the moment, the Finance Ministerial Conference of the 5 major European states and America and Japan is in session in Paris. Many wide-ranging world economic problems are under discussion. Of course, among them is the problem of oil dollars, which is responsible for leading the world economy into such great confusion, I think. Oil dollars are one of the main causes of the recent worldwide recession. In other words, all the European and American nations have been suffering from trade deficits, while, on the contrary, large sums amounting to more than $100 billion have poured into the oil-producing nations in this single year. One of the most effective remedial measures lies in an urgent realization of a program for recycling oil dollars, I believe.
プリオ教授のコメントは、再び緊迫している国際石油情勢の中で、オイルダラーの還流先のユーロ市場での融資案件のストップ状態の折から、また資源産出国に対し警告を発し、主権乱用を戒めるものとしても貴重な意見と思われますが、とにかく次にエステルマン博士からお話ししていただきましょう。では、エステルマン博士、どうぞ。
Recently, I very often hear people say that the present world economic condition is a kind of worldwide panic due to credit instability caused by many an insolvent or deficit bank, as has been seen in such nations as Austria and England, and including my Germany. It is indeed true that the panic in the 1930s was triggered by the insolvency of banks in Austria. In the cases of both the Hellschudstadt Bank in Germany and Lloyd's in England, however, the question has its source simply in exchange speculation. Indeed, every caution ought to be taken against increasing people's concern about the stability of the banks, and we should not be careless enough to call such things a panic due to credit instability. The current worldwide recession has its source mainly in demand control policy, and I hope that we will finally be able to succeed in getting over the worldwide economic crisis. If each nation immediately tries to carry out a boom-urge policy, just as the Chancellor of West Germany, Helmut Schmidt, has warned that if America should adopt a deflationary policy, it would be effective only in inviting increased unemployment and deflationary phenomena in the international market.
エステルマン博士のコメントは、市中銀行の為替操作に対する監督強化の必要性を感じさせます。また、中央銀行の市中銀行への流動性危機に何らかの援助が必要ではないかと思われます。このような点も、後ほどの討論の中で発展を見せていただけると期待しております。そこで、今度は中塚教授にお願いいたしましょ
う。時間も限られておりますので、結論を先に申し上げます。私も各講師のご意見と同様、この世界的経済危機、特に当面する世界的不況は乗り切れると思います。問題は、各国が景気刺激策を取った場合のますます激しいインフレの到来、この対策は何かであります。国際会議の場、つまり IMF、OECD などを通じて、今後論議が活発化するものとみられますが、決定的妙手を見出すことは非常に難しいと思います。私は、インフレ退治の基本は、労組会議の賃上げ抑制決議に見られるように、まさに国民の連帯意識を高め、一致してインフレ克服に当たる以外ないと思います。そして、その国の政府こそが国民をリードするものであります。日本においては、通産省の発表によれば、同省は来年から生活物資価格情報提供協力店システムを設け、この問題にメスを入れることを目的として、いわゆる作られた物価高、つまり流通段階における売り惜しみや消費段階での買いだめなどに対処することを明らかにしました。
中塚教授のお話は、日本政府が積極的な姿勢できめ細かな物価対策に臨んでいる現状をお話しくださいました。これは我々日本国民として大変励ましになるお話でした。それでは次のお話はブレイナード教授にお願いいたしましょう。先生、どうぞ。
President Ford made the remark in his policy address that the government would give top priority in its domestic policies to curbing inflation. And his statement shows how greatly the American people have suffered from recent inflation. Now, I think I'd better state my conclusion first, as my speech time is limited. To my mind, all the brains and efforts of mankind cannot but succeed in tiding us over the worldwide economic crisis confronting us today, I'm sure. To be more concrete, I think the most effective anti-inflation policy would be to try to increase and speed up productivity in connection with technology, capital, and talent as well. Just as President Ford appealed to his nation, saying, the only way to win wage increases without inviting any inflationary price increases lies in an improvement in productivity. That President Ford, with reference to this problem, also mentioned the disciplined Chinese people and the prosperity of Chinese national power was appealing enough to help enhance the solidarity among the American people in order to cope with the current inflation, I'm sure. Because I believe it impossible to curb inflation without the help of the people's good understanding and good cooperation.
今後の世界経済を予測する上で、その動向を大きく支配する米国経済の影響力は不可欠の要素です。この点、ブレイナード教授のコメントは大変貴重なものでした。もちろん、米国の経済政策、つまりフォード大統領とその新政権の政策については、後ほどの討論で活発な論議が展開されるものと思います。最後に、社会主義国の立場からのご意見をストラビンスキー博士に伺い、現下の世界的な経済危機をどう見られるかお話しいただきたいと思います。それではストラビンスキー博士、どうぞ。
To my mind, the advanced Western nations are now confronted with such a serious and difficult situation as to be forced to have to choose between the alternatives of panic or galloping inflation, just as Professor Albertson has mentioned. The contradiction between production and consumption of today is much more serious than in the 1930s when J.M. Keynes proposed it. It is more than inflation, and a policy contrary to that of Keynes has come to be adopted only to bring about recession and a slump in the stock market under inflation. How can this be called anything but a political blunder due to Keynesianism? I believe the only way to overcome the economic crisis confronting the advanced non-communist nations today is the destruction of capital and nothing else.
ありがとうございました、ストラビンスキー博士。以上で開会にあたってのご意見を6名のパネリストの方々それぞれの観点から各国の立場を代表して述べていただきました。ではこれからパネルディスカッションを始めていただくことになります。その後でブレイナード教授とストラビンスキー博士に討論のまとめと 2,3 論評を付け加えていただきたいと思います。そして30分の休会の後、皆様からのご質問に各パネリストから適宜お答えしていただくことになっております。では早速パネリストの討論を始めていただきましょう。はい、アルバートソン先生、どうぞ。
I'd like to ask a question of Professor Brainerd. The curbing inflation policy that the new Ford administration is going to carry out will be nothing but a typical demand control policy, aiming at money tightening and cutting down financial expenditures. And this, I'm afraid, will only play its part in driving the world economy into depression, just as has been feared by the Chancellor of West Germany, Helmut Schmidt. How do you view this problem, Professor Brainerd?
皆様、恐れ入りますが、ただいま議事は予定より15分ほど遅れております。従いまして残念ながら、一応ここで討論を打ち切らせていただきます。以上、様々な諸問題が出ましたが、後ほどの皆様からのご質問に期待しております。すでに質問用紙がお手元にお配りしてあると思いますが、もしご質問がございましたら、質問用紙にお書きください。休会の間に質問用紙を集めて、その後にまとめて質問やご批評にお答え願うことになっております。他に何か質問はございませんか？ないようでしたら、早速休会したいと思います。予定より遅れていますので。そして、30分後にお戻りください。では、パネリストの皆様に、ただいまから質問にお答え願います。大変多くの質問がございましたが、同種のものにつきましては、私たち委員の間で適宜にまとめさせていただき、代表的なものを選択させていただきました。まず最初の質問は、村上さんからアルバートソン教授への質問でございますが、原文通り読ませていただきます。アルバートソン教授が高く評価される賃上げ抑制を決議した今回の英労組会議での決定について、残念ながら私は納得できません。 なぜなら賃金はそれ自体としては物価後追いの性格を持ち、したがって物価上昇の主な原因とは到底思えません。さらにまた、所得政策が実施されている英国、米国のいずれもが失敗に終わっているのがその良い証拠と思います。いかがでしょうか、アルバートソン教授。お答えをお願いいたします。アルバートソン教授、どうぞ。
I will reply to his question. Of course, I don't think that wages should be the main factor of price increase either. However, if sharp wage increases should be passed on as price increases just as they are, there is no denying that it would accelerate price increases, I'm afraid. Needless to say, the basic countermeasure for high prices should lie in financial policy. At the same time, another urgent countermeasure is to strengthen the controls on the prevention of windfall price increases and the enforcement of measures concerning the publishing of cost figures, for instance. I haven't the slightest intention of saying that a problem of this kind can be solved only by curbing wages.
どうも時間がだいぶ経過してしまいました。残念ながらここで終了させていただかなくてはなりません。誠に勝手ながら何卒ご了承くださいますように。
Exercise 4-5. Section 1. Exercises for figures and phrases. Part 1. Listen to the following numbers and phrases in Japanese and change them into English. Then I'll give you the answers in English. Please practice changing them back into Japanese.
1254 1054 3005 12345 123,456 10,086 12345678 1234億5678万9987 85% 30億100以上の国3人のうち1人1000万人1年につき100ドル以下50万350万その4倍近くの比率6億ドル 5% 割引2分の1ポンド6フィート8インチ 6×7 フィート5フィート ×6 フィート ×4 フィート 1.0023 3.456 1914年から18年までの戦争2足す4は6 5引く3は2 2かける3は6 6かける3は18 6割る3は2一覧後30日払い午後2時40分発の列車午前9時30分 3時かっきり。154と2分の1。1株につき200円。我が国の鉄鋼輸出の4分の1。3代の政権。十数の紛争。西ヨーロッパの14カ国。第1号入居者。組合総数51,457。500人以上の大企業。29人以下の零細企業。我が国予算の 4%。50カ国を数える国連の新加盟国のうちの1国。1平方キロメートルあたり75,367人。我が国の男子平均寿命 71.16 歳。我が国の国民総生産の 1% の10分の7。
Answers for Part 1.
1,254. 1,054. 3,005. 12,345. 123,456. 10,086. 12,345,678. 123,456,789,987. 85%. 3 billion. More than 100 nations. 1 out of 3 people. 10 million people. Less than $100 a year. 500,000. 3,500,000. Nearly 4 times that proportion. $600 million. 5% discount. Half a pound. 6 feet 8 inches. 6 by 7 feet. 5 feet by 6 feet by 4 feet. 1.0023. 3.456. The War of 1914 to 18. 2 plus 4 equals 6. 5 minus 3 equals 2. 2 times 3 are 6. 6 times 3 are 18. 6 divided by 3 makes 2. At 30 days' sight. 2:40 p.m. train. 9:30 a.m. 3 o'clock sharp. 154 and a half. At 200 yen per share. 1/4 of our iron and steel mill exports. 3 administrations. A dozen or more disputes. 14 nations in Western Europe. The first resident. A total of 51,457 unions. Big enterprises with 500 workers or more. Small enterprises with 29 workers or less. 4% of our budget. One of the more than 50 new members of the United Nations. 75,367 persons per square kilometer. 71.16, an average lifespan for Japanese males. 0.7% of our gross national product.
Part 2. Listen to the following dates in Japanese and change them into dates in English. Then I'll give you the answers in English. Practice changing them back into Japanese.
明治23年10月30日。昭和6年4月12日。明治30年6月20日。昭和16年12月8日。大正5年1月25日。大正10年6月10日。昭和50年3月26日。大正13年9月1日。昭和45年11月9日。明治8年7月18日。
Answers for Part 2.
October 30th, 1890. April 12th, 1931. June 20th, 1897. December 8th, 1941. January 25th, 1916. June 10th, 1921. March 26th, 1975. September 1st, 1924. November 9th, 1970. July 18th, 1875.
Part 3. Listen to the following weights and measurements in Japanese and change them into their English equivalents. Then I'll give you the answers in English. Practice changing them back into Japanese.
8寸5分。1尺8寸。3尺3寸。12センチ。56センチ。1メートル83センチ。8メートル。15メートル。500メートル。4キロメートル。20キログラム。86キログラム。100キログラム。8平方メートル。30平方メートル。
Answers for Part 3.
10 inches. 1 foot 9 inches. 3 feet 3 inches. 5 inches. 1 foot 10 inches. 6 feet. 26 feet. 16 yards. 550 yards. 2.5 miles. 44 pounds. 190 pounds. 220 pounds. 9.6 square yards. 36 square yards.